ones that made you go to the moon, the ones that made you go to the Mars, they will remember this kind of genius engineer and then some guy who made a lot of money in Silicon Valley that was now thinking about their legacy. And never in my wildest imaginations could I imagine that all I had to do was combine the two characters into one. It's Elon Musk.
So, how important is it for humans to establish a new home on another planet? Today, we'll be speaking with an aerospace engineer and robotics expert to find out why Mars is the best option. We'll take a closer look at all the companies and technologies that Elon Musk has created, including SpaceX, Tesla, Neuralink, Twitter, and the Boring Company, and see how they each bring something of value to the goal of colonizing Mars. I'm looking forward to relearning more about reusable rockets, robots, electric vehicles, brain computer interfaces, underground tunnels, solar panels, and energy storage. How will we produce food and water, generate energy, and provide protection from the harsh Martian environment? We'd also need to be able to manufacture our own equipment and infrastructure using resources available on Mars, and we'd need to find ways to communicate within Mars and back to Earth. Elon Musk has made that one of his top goals. He has warned that if humans don't create a backup plan, there are a wide range of possible catastrophes, like, for example, a global war, asteroid impact, or climate change, that risk the chance for the only known consciousness to be lost. So today, we're joined by Dr. Scott Walter. Thank you, Scott, for joining me again.
Hello, Herbert. Thank you for having me back.
So, Scott is an aerospace engineer with a PhD in mechanical engineering. He co founded two robotics companies in the past, Deneb Robotics and Visual Components. Scott has worked on projects for NASA, aerospace, and defense, shipbuilding, automotive, and robotics. I've had Scott on this channel before when we talked about Tesla Bot, and he shared some incredible, never before seen proof that the bot is likely already working in Tesla's factories. Scott, thank you for coming in and helping me get brighter about how Elon and his companies will help humans live, work, and thrive in Mars. Okay, thank you, Scott, again. Appreciate this. So, very first question I need to know is why did they choose Mars? And is it even possible that Mars will be habitable and someplace that humans can actually somehow be able to live in?
It's a tall order, but yes, it can. It will require, the best of humanity to be able to do it, and all our energy is sort of focused on that. But long term, it does make sense, and you always have to start somewhere, or it will never get done. So we will make the baby steps right now, and whether we're going to have a completely verdant Mars by the end of our lifetime or our grandchildren's lifetime, that's a ways out. But you got to start. And a lot of people will say, well, why not do the moon? Why should we do Mars?
Mhm.
And there's pros and cons to both. One of them is it looks like Mars has an atmosphere that the moon doesn't, not much of an
Mhm.
atmosphere, but it's something that we can work with. And it has a slightly stronger gravity, and it may have more resources. So the moon's resources are a little bit deprived. And so we'd be able to find a little bit more in Mars. The other possibility, of course, why don't we do Venus? Well, Venus is described pretty much as a hellscape. There's no way we could really get down to the surface of Venus and do anything. We would have to do severe terraforming of Venus before we could go there. Mars, we can do it after the fact. It's going to be a little
Yeah.
bit tough at first. It's going to be like Antarctica on its coldest night when it's summertime on Mars. So we're not talking about something that's really easy, and it is very far away. But there are challenges, and I think we're up to it, and I think it can be done. And I think just for reasons of curiosity and wanderlust and everything else, it just makes sense, And
Makes sense.
yeah,
Yeah. So tell me about this photo. You're telling me that this is
yes,
what Mars looks like today, and somehow, really, it's going to be able to
someday,
look like this? Is that
someday in the
possible?
future, it's a lot of scientists believe so, others not. So it's a hot topic of debate
Yeah.
on whether that could be done. And I don't mean it as a pun, because obviously it has to get a little bit warmer to be able to do this and have a thicker atmosphere. And today we'll sort of talk about what those first steps might be to be able to get there, and
Mhm.
what the timeframes are. So there's some people that think it could be done in a reasonable time frame, and others might say it's very unreasonable. Take a very, very long time to do that. And with the technology we have today, it will be very tough to do. But that's the whole idea of going there, is to develop new technologies and to see what
Yeah.
we can do and to create new ideas, absolutely new industries, give humanity a chance to really stretch out and see what we can do, and use this as a springboard for the colonizing the rest of the solar system. Because I mean, why not? There's just so much to learn. Why,
Before we get there, let's
yeah,
talk about Mars still. I guess you do have to tell me, like, what is the plan? And first you said moon, and then from moon to Mars, and the time
right.
frame. But just before we go there, tell me about, like, what got you interested in Mars? Why did you start reading up on this? What is your knowledge, and how did you get this knowledge?
Okay, well, I'm a child of the '60s, and of course, in 1969 this event happened. And
Okay.
I was 11 years old when Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin landed on the moon. And it's one of those days that I can remember. I know exactly where I was. My brothers know exactly where they were because we were all there together. And it was definitely something that I already was interested in before the landing happened. So probably when I
Yeah.
was 8 or 9, it was really getting into it. I was building all these, the Revell models of the Saturn V and the Gemini and the Mercury spacecraft and everything, and knew all the facts. In fact, when you were first having to take books out from grade school, and when you
Mhm.
go up to the school librarian, all the boys were asking for books on Davy Crockett, and I was asking for books on the Navy rocket. And so that's pretty much what I was doing and what I preferred to read and wanted to study. And the reason why this National Geographic is important is if you go back to it for a second, you'll see that it says up there that it's December 1969, but they landed in July.
Mhm.
But the thing about
Mhm.
National Geographic is it wasn't about covering current events. That was what Life magazine was for. But
Mhm.
it was about actually doing a deep dive into what happened. So you found out a lot about, what was kind of the aftermath of being there. They could really go into it. And what was really important to a lot of us was like this one article that was written by Thomas O'Payne, who was the NASA administrator at that time, of what the next steps are. And the next steps were going to Mars. I
Mhm.
mean, it was talking about that. And now, when Apollo happened, I was 11 years old, and I was really disappointed. I was just too young. It's like, oh, I wish I was older. Maybe I would have could have been the first man on the moon. So at that point,
Mhm.
it's like, well, my goal is to be the first man on Mars, right? Then I read this
Oh.
article, and it was absolutely crestfallen because you can see the dates that he's talking about here. Oh, the window is going to open in October 1983, and they're going to land in
Mm.
1984 after about a 9 month journey there. So everything is laid out, and I'm doing the math. It's like, I'll only be in my mid-20s. I'll be too young again. Okay. So be careful what you wish for. So, now it's the other way. It's like, oh, by the time we really
Mm.
do it, I might be a bit too old, but I've got an answer for that
Yeah.
that we'll get to. So that certainly got me started, that, they realizing that we're going to do it. The problem is, and he explains in there, is that NASA did not have a directive to do it, but they've already kind of thought the whole process out, and they're kind of a hint, hint, nudge, nudge. We're waiting for Congress to back this up.
Mm.
Now, can you
Mhm.
name the first politician who actually proposed that we should go to Mars?
Well, it's not Kennedy, or was it Kennedy?
It wasn't Kennedy. Kennedy was the moon,
The moon.
but who do you
Buzz
think was the
Aldrin.
first politician? No, no, politician. Because
Oh,
there were a
he
lot of
was an
people
no
that said we should go to
politician,
the
didn't he?
moon.
Yeah. Okay, I
Buzz
don't know.
Aldrin was not. Nope, nope. He was never elected. So,
Oh,
a
okay.
politician. A lot of people would be surprised. You might have thought
Reagan.
it was Nixon or Reagan.
Okay.
No, it wasn't.
Yeah.
It was
Yeah.
actually Spiro Agnew, the
I
vice
don't know. Yeah.
president, Nixon's vice
Vice
president.
president
It
of.
was more or less like a trial balloon because he said he was advocating for funding to go to Mars because he thought that'd be the next thing. And that's about as far as it got. So the Vietnam War was going on. Funding was being cut back from Apollo. So we ended
Yeah.
at Apollo 17, and it was very clear we weren't going to go that route. And so things kind of continued on. You had kind of the malaise of the 70s, and then and it was kind of a sad time, the end of the 70s, because Jimmy Carter was the last American president in which there were no Americans in space while he was during his term of president. It wasn't until Reagan that we were able to get the space shuttle to go up. And it was almost like a rocket to nowhere. It's like, oh, we're going to low Earth orbit. What are we doing it for? And there were some exciting projects, like Hubble and building a space station, but it just didn't capture the imagination. Everyone was waiting for it. And then
Mhm.
I can remember it was like late 90s, and there was a PBS special with Alan Alda, and he was talking about this mission to Mars. And I was like absolutely intrigued. Like, wow, on network television, they're actually talking about space, and because there had been nothing about that. It was like everything else, but no one's really caring about it. It's like the first time. And he was talking about this idea from this aerospace scientist named Dr. Robert Zubrin and his book, Mars Direct. And of course, the next day, I ran out to the bookstore
Yeah.
and bought the book.
Yeah.
Okay. All
Yeah.
right. That's this book right here.
Wow.
Yeah. We actually did that back in those days. And so I bought that. And I can trust you that Elon Musk already had a copy of this book way before that.
Mm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So, I just devoured it. And it was very interesting what he talked about. And there was another politician who proposed or was about to propose a mission to Mars. And that would be the first Bush Sr. in 1990. And they ended up getting a committee together to kind of study the feasibility of a manned mission to Mars and how much it would cost. And they came back to HW and told him $400 billion. And, it was like, what? There's no way Congress is going to say $400 billion. And of course, whenever they come up with an estimate, there's a factor of 2 or 3 involved, and that's like on the way up, not the way down. So realistically, the proposal would probably be in the order of $1 trillion or more. And so he knew that was not going to fly and it wasn't going to work. And the thing is, Robert Zubrin was aware of kind of what that proposal was, and he saw they were doing it completely wrong. So he had a very, very different approach to it. So what was wrong with the Bush one was what Robert Zubrin describes as the Battlestar Galactica approach. In other words, they were going to build this huge spaceship in Earth orbit and then use that to go to Mars. And it would be the analogy of that when the first explorers came over to the New World, rather than doing it on the Viking longships like it was, they said, nah, we're not going to do it till we build a Carnival cruise liner. Okay. So
Yeah, I gotcha.
that's their approach, is like, we're going to make this really big thing. So it's very different than Payne's idea that you would have a 6-man crew with like 2 almost Apollo-like modules that are going there to be able to go in there and come back. So Zubrin studied it and he realized, no, it could be done for a lot less. And he thought it could be done for $2 billion. So that he was maybe a bit low, but still $2 billion. And he was taking this different analogy. And the reason why he's calling it direct is that a lot of the problem was that when you go to the moon, you have to bring everything that you need when you go to the moon to be able to come back.
Mm-hmm.
But he's saying
Mm-hmm.
that's not the way the explorers did it. So Lewis and Clark, when they did the Oregon Trail, they didn't bring all the water and all the food they needed. They foraged along the way. They just brought kind of what they needed for their starter kit. And then, when they needed supplies, they figured out a way to set up a camp and resupply. And so he was looking at that problem and saying that, well, one of the problems of doing the trip is that the fuel we need to come back, we got to bring with us, which means our rockets have to be even bigger to bring the fuel that we need for the return trip. So why not actually make the fuel on Mars? Now that meant thinking very differently, because up to that time, most rockets either used hydrogen or they used kerosene. And hydrogen is not widely available on Mars as far as we know. If it is, it's going to be in water form. But from what we can tell, there's like none of it in the atmosphere. It's not readily accessible. And kerosene, well, that's a fossil fuel. And I'm not sure you're going to find that on Mars. And if you do, you're going to have to set up a refinery and everything else. So there had to be some other solution. And that's when they realized, well, the Martian atmosphere is made up primarily of carbon dioxide. And there is this famous process out there called the Sabatier process, which knows how to convert with hydrogen carbon dioxide into methane with, I think, a byproduct of hydrogen along with it. So, no, not hydrogen, of oxygen. So you would get oxygen out of it. So it was like, wow, this is a great idea. We can take the atmosphere of Mars and turn it into the propellant that we need to go back. And it also will become kind of a fuel source. So we can produce it and we get oxygen. So that means the oxygen that we need to breathe, we don't have to bring it with us. It's just going to be there. The only thing we need is energy. So the idea is that
So
they
you want
put
to
a
show
reactor
the
up there.
paper there? I guess the
Oh,
question I've got right
yeah,
away is that, so you're
yeah.
saying that Elon likely read this book, and do
Oh,
you
yeah,
think that
absolutely,
everything you
yes,
just said in the last 5 minutes here is likely the way it's going to
yes.
happen?
It
Okay.
absolutely is, because Elon has said that, and Robert Zubrin has said that, and they are good friends. They talk all the
Oh,
time about that. So
oh,
absolutely. So Elon was inspired a lot by this, as well as everyone else. So
you want to show the
um,
paper? Yeah.
yeah, so somewhere down here is this process right here, which is the
Hmm.
Sabatier process. Actually, so this is the Sabatier reaction where you just take CO2,
Hmm.
add some hydrogen, and you're able to get, see, in one case, yeah, I guess you get water out of it. So you get the water, not the oxygen, sorry. So you get the water that you need out of it as well. Um, and so you need those consumables there, which means you don't have to bring it all. All you have to do is bring the hydrogen with you. So that's part of the idea, is that we need some hydrogen, but you don't need as much hydrogen as you normally would need for the return trip. And you don't need the oxidizer. So it's like,
Gotcha.
and there's a way to be able to produce the oxygen as well. So that was the idea of kind of living off the land approach. We produce what we want. And Zubrin's plan was that you first send, when one of the Mars windows opens up, unmanned missions that go there with a reactor that actually start fueling up everything, because it takes a long time to do it. It could take 18 months for this process to work, to do everything for the return trip. So you make sure everything is working, and then you send the manned crews there. And when they land in the same area, and now they have a rocket ready to go. And of course, right after, that was also the inspiration for this other book here called The Martian by Andy Weir.
The movie?
It became a movie. It was first a book.
Yes.
And the thing about it is that he basically wrote the book that I wanted to write, because as soon as I saw Zubrin's, idea, I said, the only thing that's missing is capturing the public imagination. Someone's got to write a narrative, a book about it that will capture everyone's mind. And I'm the type of person that, while I like a certain amount of science fiction, I like it to be more in science fact than total fiction with all these weird alien monsters and stuff like that. And if you notice on the book, if you go back to it, you'll notice that Andy Weir does not call it a science fiction. It's called a novel.
Oh, okay.
Because it's really based on a lot of fact. And so it's not really science fiction, because he's really saying that this could happen. This is, while it's fictional, it's not science fictional. Everything that's there. And my feeling was like, someone's got to capture the public imagination, which he did. And a few years ago, Andy Weir was interviewed by Joe Scott, and they were talking about the writing process and everything else. And Andy Weir was saying, well, what you got to do is, like, every day you've got to, write. You got to write a couple of pages, because if you don't, otherwise you're daydreaming. And he basically described what I had been doing for like 10 years, is that, I had to imagine the whole scenario. I knew what it was. I had like a book in my head that, like, I was the only person that read this book, because it was like in my head, but never really being committed, with all these ideas and how it would work. And I kind of had it set up. And I'm going to ask you a very simple question, Herbert. How many European royals can you name from 500 years ago?
None. Zero.
For the past, I mean, you might be able to say, there's like, there's a Queen Elizabeth in there, and there's some Henry VIII, right? And then you might be able to say, there was like a Louis the 16th, so there's going to be a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's like, that's cheating, all right? So as far as like you really thinking of some that have made such an impact that later generations can answer them, there is one. I mean, if you really think about it, and there was a queen, and she was from Spain, and her name was Isabella, right? Ferdinand and Isabella. And why do you remember them today?
Sure. Well, we know why.
Yes.
Because they're the ones that discovered the new land or paid for the ships.
In their day, every single member of the royal families throughout Europe, they were like the most important people of their day, yet they're completely forgotten today. So who are the ones that are remembered? So now answer the question, which American presidents do you think will be remembered 500 years from now?
Sure. Yeah, you're going to say Kennedy, right?
You're going to get Washington in there because it's the first one.
Course.
Probably Lincoln. And Kennedy. All right. So the imagination is like, what do you do to become that kind of person? So I'm thinking like, okay, the problem with going to Mars is at first you need a guy who's like really smart, and then you also need like a lot of money, and like the government's not going to do it. But the thing that Zubrin pointed out, and this is what like kind of shocked me, is he said, it could be done for $2 billion. And that's when I almost fell on my chair. This is like 1997. I'm like, $2 billion, that can be privately funded. I mean, there are billionaires out there that they can write the check tomorrow and do that. And I think it was like, all you have to do is go up and persuade one of them that, this is your Ferdinand and Isabel moment. This is the one that is going, like, 500 years from now, they're going to remember you. The Rockefellers and the Carnegies, they're going to be in the Vanderbilts. They'll be forgotten 500 years from now, because while they did great things and they were these big industrialists, the grand scheme of things are going to be forgotten. So the ones that made you go to the moon, the ones that made you go to the Mars, they will remember. So I can imagine, that's how you go ahead and do it. So that was like my plot line. It's like I had this kind of genius engineer, and then some guy who made a lot of money in Silicon Valley that was now thinking about their legacy. And never in my wildest imaginations could I imagine that all I had to do was combine the two characters into one. It's
Yeah,
like,
Elon can
it's
do it.
Elon Musk.
Uh,
And this is kind of changes. And this is where I think we might want to do a little bit different approach
mm,
of what Zubrin is that he's thinking of the problem of going to Mars and back. And it actually, he got a lot of pushback from a lot of people in the society of within the scientific community, um, for I guess what you would call his exuberance. Okay, a little bit of a pun there, because
sure.
he's so passionate about it. You just listen to him talk because it's just amazing. Problem is, he stepped on a lot of toes, and all the toes he stepped on absolutely deserve to be stepped on. And they were like, "Oh, we can't do that because biocontamination. If you come back here, or the return trip's going to be really hard. You've got all, the radiation hazards on the way out and the way back, and everything like that. So there's all these reasons why you can't do it." And the other thing to remember is a lot of the cost of these mission is not the mission to go there; it's the mission to
Mm,
go there and back. And 2/3 of your energy and cost is figuring out how do you come back. If you look at any mission profile, they're talking about 9 months out, in minimum maybe 90 days or up to 18 months actually in Martian orbit before the window opens up before you can come back. So it's like,
come back.
well, wait a
Yeah.
minute. If you can survive 18 months up there on Mars, I bet you can find a way to stay up there for 18 years. So I was starting to think, aha, it's going to be a
One way.
one-way trip. So that's what my novel was going to be about. It's like, it's a one-way trip that you're just going to go there and do it that way. Now, the other thing to think about is that all the hazards that are going on, you've got radiation exposure when you're actually doing the journey out there. The possibility of cancers and everything else is that when people come back, their health might be really bad. So this whole idea that we get this generation of astronauts who are like in the prime of their life, they're 35, they got a couple of young ones at home and stuff like that, and we're going to send them off on this 3 or 5 year mission, however long it comes back, and who knows what's going to happen. It'd be absolutely tragic that people that age, would come back, and it's like, no one's going to go into that because they're going to just see it as a suicide mission. So I'm thinking like, who should we be sending? We should be sending people who don't have attachments back them. They don't have family that they are thinking about, or would have like this regret halfway there. Oh, should I have really gone? And because there's no turning around. Once you go, you're committed. And so I'm thinking, you know what? Mars should be the ultimate 55 plus community. and, and the idea is that, and of course you have to worry about how people get along and everything else. And so there
Sure.
are a lot of couples in academia that have like the
Mm,
scientific experience and background and training that almost would be perfect for going there. So that's like
mhm.
the mission
Okay.
profile I'm sort of thinking. They may not be charismatic enough to kind of like get a lot of the public imagination because they want something else. But that was a feeling. And of course, when I pitched this idea to my family, and never pitch an idea to your family, all right, because they will always shoot it down. They're like, that sounds crazy. No one would ever want to do that. And obviously, they never looked like the waiting list to spend like a year in Antarctica. you know,
Mhm.
there are people who want to do it. And so they thought it was a crazy idea until then I suddenly hear, I think it was like Science Friday in around 2003 or something like that. And Lawrence Krauss, who's a professor from the University of Arizona, suggests the exact same thing. We should just go one way and not come back. And like,
Mhm.
no, why didn't they, so
That's
he
your
came up,
idea.
because he had the courage to get it out there. And as soon as he did that, you know what happened? Like
Mm,
100,000 people signed up. Yeah, we'll go. So it's not that crazy. And there's a lot of reasons you'd want to do that. So we're not talking about necessarily full blown colony like everyone wants, but probably a scientific outpost that will take
yeah.
years to get up to the stage that you can then get, what Elon's vision is. But at first, you got to start there. You got to find out what kind of resources and everything else. And that's like my long winded introduction of what's going on. And now we should start deep diving in some of the technology and
Yeah.
aspects that you're sort of
Um,
thinking about are going to be the
Fantastic. Well,
problems.
it's a good setup. I mean, you explained how it all worked and you explained how the thinking is. So, yeah, Elon Musk, all of his technologies, how they work. Do you want to go in order of, leaving Earth and then arriving there, or do you want to do it on segments of, different topics?
Well, I mean, the first thing that everyone kind of wonders is like, well, how do we get there? What's the mission profile?
Yeah.
And I'll show this. I think you can go ahead and show this right now. I don't know if you are aware that this is the picture of the back of a T-shirt, a
Uh-huh.
Starlink T-shirt, right? And it's the same thing here that you'll see on the Starlink router. Okay,
Yeah.
what's this got to do with Starlink? Well, almost nothing. What this is known as is the home and transfer orbit. So what you're seeing in the center of the picture is the sun. And the
Mhm.
inner circle is the orbit of the Earth. The outer circle is the orbit of Mars. And
Mhm.
the circle that connects those two is what's known as the Hohmann transfer orbit. That's the most energy efficient orbit to be able to go from Earth to Mars. And it's only when the two planets sort of line up in a particular way that you have what they call the window that you can actually launch there. And that happens about every 2 years. Maybe it's like every 25 months or every 26 months it's possible, roughly every 2 years. And the way to look at it is that I like to use the analogy of a quarterback and a wide receiver, right? Is there's a timing pattern that you have. So you get the wide receiver who is in motion going behind the quarterback, and the quarterback, gets the snap from the center, who is the sun, and he's kind of rolling out a little bit while the running back is running behind him.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
as soon as the running back gets to a certain position, he throws the pass, but he doesn't throw
Mhm.
it to where the wide receiver is. He's throwing it to where the wide receiver will be. So the timing has to be just right, that if you decide that you want them to match up, you know exactly where it is. And a good quarterback can do it blindfolded. They just close their eyes and know exactly what the pattern is. They work in that. It's all about timing. And it's the same thing when you want to go from Earth to Mars, is you have to wait until your wide receiver has kind of like crossed the line of scrimmage, is at a certain location. So to go from low Earth orbit to the Martian orbit, to bring yourself up there, you need to transfer into that higher orbit. And the amount of time it will take you to do that is roughly 9 months.
Mhm.
And so what that means is that you have to do it when Mars is about halfway from the position that you're going to intercept at. So, or not, sorry, 9 months back. So you would back it back a little bit 9 months.
Right.
So it's not behind
Yeah.
Earth. It's kind of come around Earth a little bit. And it's like, oh, we're nine
There you
months
go.
away. Start to throw the pass, and you go right there. Now, the other thing about a pass is a good pass from a quarterback is you want to make sure it's just like a really soft pass. It just lands right in his hand so he doesn't fumble it. And this is the other problem, is that you don't want to come in with too much energy. So you can get to Mars a lot faster. The problem is you need the brakes. Otherwise, you're going to overshoot. So there's a certain amount of retro that you're going to need, which either could be aero braking. You actually go in the atmosphere to try to slow yourself down, or you're going to have to waste some propellant to be able to slow yourself down to get into a capture orbit around there. So there's a lot of different mission profiles, but that's basically why we only have this window of opportunity every 24 months. Without a
Mhm.
much more powerful propulsion system, like they're proposing, like nuclear, there's no way we'd be able to do it other than this for now. So that's why, what's the next one? 2025 or something like that. And so
Mhm.
about every 2 years is one. So
Okay.
that
And then
that is
so
how we get there.
SpaceX is gonna do this. They're testing out
Hmm.
their rocket now, right? And then do you think
Yes,
they'll make
yes,
it for the next round? And then yeah, why did I mean the Starlink is owned by SpaceX, so maybe that's the reason why
yes,
they do this, or is there
yes.
another signal maybe that Starlink is going to be critical? Of course it will
Well,
be,
of
but
course, because the transmission between Earth and Mars is very long. Sometimes you're very close. Sometimes I think you might be as close as, maybe it might be like 5 or 10 minutes away, and then other times it's more than 20 minutes away. So depending on where they are in the orbit, if they're in kind of conjunction, very close, then it's a much shorter transmission signal. But if on the opposite side of the sun, which you're kind of seeing in this picture, and in those cases you actually can't transmit, because when it's directly behind the sun, signals are lost. So there's one thing is you need to have that line of sight. It's going to take maybe up to 20 minutes to go one way and then to get the return signal. So you know how that is when you have a satellite lag, as it is here on Earth. Everyone complains about, imagine a 20-minute signal. So everything is
right.
going to have to almost be text-based, or a video file or something like that, because you're not going to have a one-to-one kind of conversation like what we're having. The other thing is, like, what do you do when the sun's in the middle and it's critical you have the transmission? But the last thing is the data rates are very, very slow. So the amount of data that you can transmit is extremely slow. So you don't want to be thinking, well, how can we improve that? And a lot of the problem is because the radio signals attenuate out. You've got to have these big radio telescopes to be able to capture the information. They're going to be in the right part of the planet for that to happen. It's really slow. Well, there might be some things we can do to speed it up, at least the data rates, and that is like you do laser
Mhm.
connections. So you would need to have some satellites to bounce them off. So obviously on Mars, if you start to have a colony or at least explorers around there, they need to be able to communicate. And in many cases, you might upload something to some satellites that are in the orbit, and then they can beam those things directly back to Earth, or to some intermediate satellite somewhere that it bounces off. Starts to sound a lot like the Starlink constellation, doesn't it? And the question is where those things are going to go. And we're going to point to that in a few cases of where those satellites might be positioned. Now, we can see there's a lot of things that we're going to do is that we're going to have to create our own rocket fuel if we want to get back. But that rocket fuel is going to be useful for other things than just rocket fuel because it's methane. So that means you can use it for powering rovers if necessary, for heating and everything else. So it'll be a store of energy. And the thing is, these processes are going to require power. They're going to require energy. So the biggest problem you're going to have on Mars is it's going to be an energy crisis because you're going to need energy in order to be able to take those resources and convert them into something that you need. We need oxygen. Hopefully we'll be able to find water, or we're going to have to make the water through the Sabatier process and be able to create the methane. Ironically, at first, looking at it, it's like, well, we know solar will work there because it already has kind of proven itself. But you have to kind of put it a little bit in perspective, is that Mars is a little bit further from the sun. It's 1.5 times the distance from the sun, which means you have to square that to find out what the actual amount is coming in is and take the reciprocal of that. So square of that is like 2.25, the reciprocal of that, 44%. So that means Mars sees 44% of the amount of incoming sunlight, which means your solar panels are suddenly only 44% of what you're used to having here on Earth. So it's like, it's already, right around where it might be acceptable. Is that going to be all right? The other thing to remember is that on Mars, we're going to be on the equator. And most people with their solar panels, they're in mid-latitudes. So being at the equator, it's already going to be a little bit. So that will give you almost a 30% improvement over where the typical solar panels are on the Earth. So it's like, you bump that up. So maybe we're around 50% there. The other thing is that we lose a lot of that solar energy coming into the atmosphere. Mars doesn't have much of an atmosphere. So you might want to think about thickening that atmosphere if you don't want your solar panels to go down in performance. So the thin atmosphere means we're getting more coming in. The other thing is solar panels tend to perform really poorly when they get hot, get very warm, on really sunny days, ironically. So if they overheat. Mars, you're not going to have that problem. They'll probably stay pretty cool. So that means we'll get decent performance out of them. The only thing we have to worry about is the Martian dust always getting them in. And if we're there, we're able to clean them up and do it. So we'll be able to get it. But the one problem with solar, what is the problem with solar, Herbert?
What is the problem with solar? You keep asking me these questions. I don't know.
Yeah, well,
You just
it's like,
addressed it,
this is something that Amy and Bradford have been talking a lot about. And that is, it only works
battery
during the
packs to
daytime.
store it. Oh, it works in the
You need to
daytime, of
store it.
course. But
You
I
need to
assume that
store it.
because you're in Mars, yeah, you need to store it. But I assume because you're in right.
Yep. Yeah,
Mars,
you absolutely need to store it, right? So
Yeah.
that's going to be one of the things that you need to have. And so you need to say, well, what's going to be the best way to store this energy? And thinking about it, it's like, well, they use batteries for the most part. There are some, but for the amount of battery storage, I'm not sure if you can do it. And it might almost make sense to do it the old-fashioned way, since we've got the Sabatier process and we have to do all these other things. It may be that we have to go to a lot of methane production for the energy storage that we're going to have there, because we're going to be using the methane for everything else. Now, a lot of times people will scream and holler, it's so bad because you're losing so much going this way and back. It's all getting generated into heat. Well, let me tell you, the biggest problem you're going to have on Mars is heating. So if you build all these systems right, there is no such thing as waste heat. That waste heat is just going to be used for everything else you need. So it may be that things will be, there'll be the solar, but it's not clear how much you're going to have the batteries there. And the other bad news about heating is that forget about heat pumps. They're not going to work on Mars for a couple of reasons. It's too cold.
What? I was
If we
assuming
can
that
get a
Tesla's heat HVAC will be able to
we'll
be
see.
used for
If
that.
they can
'Cause
get an HVAC to work in Antarctica, you might have a chance. But the outside temperature is just too cold. You're talking, and the best like around 0 degrees centigrade, but it's much, much lower. But even if you have it up around 0 degrees, there's another problem. The Martian atmosphere is so thin. So the actual thermal mass is like, there's almost nothing there. So you could have I think in the summertime in the equator, it might get up to 70 degrees. But the heat content is so little because the density term that's in there is practically nothing. So there's almost nothing to extract from. So it'll be very hard to get it. So the other thing is like, well, then just take it from the ground, just do geothermal. And it's like, well, it's not called geothermal on Mars. It's called, I think, aerial thermal. I'm not even sure if that's a word, but it's, from Ares. and the ground is pretty cold. I tried looking it up, and there's like, yeah, the ground temperature at the surface is like minus 55 degrees centigrade. Like, wow. So, yeah, that's not a really good heat source unless you come up with some kind of heat pump cycle that can actually work in that. Now, it's not absolute zero, so it's literally, it is better than nothing. And who knows, maybe they're going to work in a process to do it, but the efficiency of a heat pump at that point goes way, way,
Mm.
way down. So you're probably going to have some of these nuclear reactors and everything else. But I'm thinking you also want to have some sort of battery storage. And this is where it kind of got me thinking, is that, do we want to send megapacks to Mars? Does it make sense to send a megapack to Mars? It'd be nice to have a megapack on Mars for sure, for all that solar
Can you
collection.
can you make a megapack and Mars? Does it have lithium? Does it have the
That's the thing,
minerals?
is it doesn't makes absolutely no sense, because that is
No.
so heavy to put there. So I'd say, no, no, you wouldn't put it there. The question is, do we have it? I think there might be lithium. I'm pretty sure, because Mars is red, gets a lot of that red from the iron. So there's plenty of
Hmm.
iron. And which battery chemistries work best in the cold?
I have no idea.
LFP.
LFP. Okay.
LFP. Okay,
Yeah,
so
lithium.
not
Yeah, okay.
lithium ion,
Lithium
but
iron.
LFP.
Yeah, lithium
And you
ferrous.
don't
Yeah.
really care that much about, for normal kind of storage, you don't care about the mass that much. Plus, it's 1/3 gravity. So if you do put it on a vehicle, it's like, who cares? It's a lot lighter. So that's not going to be a big deal. So you want something that has pretty good cold weather performance, something that cycles really well, something you can bring up and down, and it maybe is made from local minerals. There might be some lithium around there. Have to check, because lithium is not, it should be available, because it's like the third you get helium, you get hydrogen, helium, and lithium. So it's one of those that is kind of
Yeah.
abundant in some form. So you should be able to get it. And if not, the amount of lithium you need in a battery is very small compared to everything else. The worst case, you bring it from Earth. The main thing is, like, how do we actually refine these minerals and do that process? Now,
It's a good thing
what's
that Elon and Tesla's doing that right now, lithium and refinery, so they could take that
yeah,
knowledge
yeah.
and do
So I'm
things.
kind of wondering about, it's like, and they're looking in the lithium refinery. I wonder what it's about. But the other thing is that occurred to me is that, if you are going to manufacture batteries on Mars, I mean, manufacturing anything is going to be tough. You're just thinking of, like, oh, the infrastructure of having a smelter and all this other stuff that you might want to have. Now, if you look at battery production, we know we kind of look at the footprint there, and it's like, wow, there's like all these ovens. And remember, I talked about heat being a problem, heating on Mars. So if you get an industrial process that needs a lot of heat, you might want to think twice about that.
Mm. Mhm.
Um, and so you need the ovens and everything else. And then it's like, well, there is a new manufacturing process for batteries that
So yeah.
requires, what, 1/10 the footprint,
Mhm.
and doesn't require any heat. And it's called the dry electrode process.
Ah, the dry electric, of course.
The
Yeah.
4680, the 4680s is about Mars. Yeah,
Wow.
it's about Mars. And it's
Wow.
about making some way of being able to manufacture batteries with very
Yeah.
simple raw materials coming in that you figured out, and that you can just build this thing and then send it up there. So we don't have to come up with like a gigafactory. Now, we don't have to at first, because remember, we're building these really big battery plants because we need batteries for 8
Everything.
billion people. We don't have 8
Yeah.
billion people on Mars yet. We've got a small number. We were talking about half dozen,
Mm.
eventually 100, and then it gets a bit. So at that point, we don't have to pump out a lot of batteries. So you can probably come up with some sort of small manufacturing unit to be able to produce them at a reasonable level at the scale
Mhm.
that you need for it. So that's the
Mhm.
thing I was saying, is like, oh, okay. It's like every time you look at something, it's like there is a reason for that. And so the 4680s, I think a lot of that has to do with
Mhm.
Mars, and not just relying on methane. It will be important. That's going to be a very important constituent for being able to get back, but also to be able to run equipment. And like I say, if you need heating
Mm.
and you need a lot of heat right away.
And then tell me about bots, your favorite topic.
Yeah, well, the
They're
bots are
definitely
going
gonna
to be
be the
important for
first there, right?
starting out. Yeah,
Yeah.
they'll be the first ones there. They're going to be the scouts, and I think they would probably go in the very first mission. So a lot of the ideas that there'd be these automated spacecraft that would just go down there. A few little things would happen, set up the reactors and everything, and go. And the idea is it's just like almost automated. No humanoids or humans needed. But that might change. So now the idea of having the bot there is it can do a lot of the um, scouting that would be necessary for good sites, looking around where the mineral deposits are, being able to service equipment, make sure if anything is wrong, being able to take care of it, setting up a lot of the habitats. So, at first the idea is like you're just going to live in your spacecraft until you can set up your
All right.
campsite or something like that. But you might be able to come there and it's like, wow, look, everything is already set up and ready. The other thing that's going to be important, as we learned from Boca Chica, is when you land, you're going to create quite the dust storm.
Hmm.
So we don't even have a concrete pad there. We just have the regolith, and we're just going to be kicking that regolith up all over the place.
Mhm.
And you may need to be able to prepare something. And so there are some ideas out there on how you could do something to prepare the soil.
Mhm.
They've even talked about like laser sintering and stuff like that that are very interesting. But some of them might just involve the bots going out and preparing something so you have a kind of a landing pad so when you come down you are not creating this dust storm, which is just going to create all sorts of havoc and issues and potentially compromise the craft when it comes down, because the last thing you want that to happen is that you crash just before you're ready to land because something got kicked up. So
Gotcha.
that will be important. The bots are going to do a lot. And the other thing, hopefully they might be setting up the greenhouses, because as you know there's a lead time for food
Food,
production.
yeah. So you think it's
And
gonna be greenhouses and it's gonna be real plants and real,
oh yeah,
food rather
yeah,
than
yeah, yeah, yeah.
manufactured food? Yeah.
Oh, there's going to be different. There's probably, I mean, I know Tony Seba has talked a lot about the precision fermentation. So there's definitely going to be a certain amount of that, and certainly we can see that Kimball Musk is. I mean, he's working on those ideas for sure, on
Yeah.
how you would be able to come up with hydroponics and other ways of being able to do it. Um,
Yeah.
the first thing you need is soil. So the biggest problem is the Martian regolith is full of these peroxides that you need to be able to clear those out. Sorry, not peroxides, perchlorates. And they're very hazardous to anything, and you really can't grow anything with it. So they would need a certain amount of processing. But it's believed that that can be done, and that you would be able to then use that as your feedstock inside some sort of greenhouses that would obviously not be outside. We need to make sure that they stay warm and hydrated. And you would need some sort of bot to go around and tend them and make sure they're up and growing, so that when they land, they have everything. And it's going to be more than greenhouses. It's going to be this big cycle with all sorts of things. So, ideas that you would probably have maybe even some fish that you'd be able to bring on, because fish will probably be the easiest of, if you were going to bring any sort of, I don't know if you want to call that
Food
livestock.
source.
I mean, bringing
Mhm.
chickens and cows, that's just not going to happen. There's
Gotcha.
very few things that we can think of, but fish kind of makes sense because it's
Yeah.
very easy to transport the fish eggs over a long period of time. When they get there, okay, now you've got them, and hopefully, and then you can find them, and they may be very good at being able to put algae in the water and these other things, come up with a cycle that they can clean the water, produce a lot of nutrients. You get this closed ecosystem to produce everything that you need. And once you get the greenhouses, of course, what's one of the things that greenhouses will produce? They like taking in CO2, they like producing oxygen. So that means we don't have to worry that
Makes
much
sense.
about how our oxygen production is done. We can do that. And
Yeah.
eventually that scales up and gets bigger and bigger. And then hopefully at some point we could talk about these big algae ponds or cyanobacteria that creates lots and lots of oxygens by feeding all that stuff, and that'll be part of the terraforming, because that's how Earth was terraformed. Earth was terraformed. It
Right.
wasn't like this. It didn't start out this way. It started out very, very differently, and then eventually a cyanobacteria came around, and over a couple 100 million years converted the atmosphere from this toxic atmosphere, whatever it was, to the atmosphere we enjoy today. So that was a long process. That's why I say you need time. A lot of time,
Gotcha.
even though you're talking about trillions of these organisms that are just able to do that every day, but they got to do it over a long period of time, and they need energy. So they needed all the energy that the sun was bringing to the earth over a 100 million year period. So can we speed that up? I don't know. But if we, actually use biology to do it, it'll probably be slow.
Mhm. Okay, so let's see. You talked about reusable rockets to get us out there. We talked about
Hmm.
robots as scouts to get us in there. We talked about underground tunnels with the boring,
Hmm.
possibly for some parts of it. Solar panels, energy storage, um, maybe the HVAC, maybe not the HVAC. And then what about the electric vehicles? So Cybertruck going to be there,
Hmm.
and And what about brain computer interface? Is that even necessary? You talked about Starlink being used to communicate, but do you even need to have Neuralink somehow? Is that even
Yeah,
associated, or is that complete nothing to do with Mars?
that's hard to say. I don't see how Neuralink fits in the picture. Doesn't mean it doesn't. It doesn't mean someone doesn't have
Right.
a grand scheme. Just that I'm not smart enough to see how that would work. I can see how the boring machine would work. I can see how potentially working on some of these HVAC is, because HVAC is about climate control of some sort. And so you're going to need that. And I'm sure they'll be able to come up with some sort of breakthroughs to figure out how to make it more efficient. So you need to have that's for sure. Obviously, the communication is very important with Starlink and the technology they're developing there, and using lasers to be able to communicate between different spacecraft is very important. It's going to be done that way because that's the only way you can get the bandwidth that you would need.
Yeah.
There may be a need for some small nuclear reactors. Robert Zubrin has said you definitely need that for the jumpstart, so that might be something that they jumpstart on. Something maybe they work on because Elon is not opposed to the idea
Right.
of different kinds of nuclear reactors that make sense in some places. So I would not be surprised if they're not thinking about making something that's small and portable. We're not talking about, one of the huge plants that's here, but something that would be able to work and be efficient. And there's a lot of different ideas out there that are not necessarily uranium based, like some of these thorium breeder reactors and others. Some that can almost be very, very compact. So I see that. The interesting thing and why heat's going to be a problem is that we think when we go into a cave or we take the regolith that the earth makes this great insulation. So a lot of times we will see people in cold climates that's like, yeah, you build your house kind of into the ground and it's going to give a certain amount of warmth. It's like, well, on the earth, the average temperature when you go down a little bit, it might be around 59 degrees. So it's not really warm, but it's not really that cold. And in a very cold winter's day can provide a certain amount of warmth and insulation. The problem with is the ground temperature. I'm not talking about the ground temperature, like I say, it's like minus 55 degrees centigrade. It will probably be the worst form of insulation almost because you build your habitat and you're putting it up against this very massive thing, this massive heat source or sink at this point, which is at minus 55 degrees centigrade. It probably is not going to be the best form of insulation. You're going to have to make something between that. It's going to be great for stopping incoming radiation, but it's not exactly going to be like the pink insulation that you put into your home. So it will have to be changed a little bit. And so there may be some sort of chemistries and other ways of being able to do that. So vapor barriers and others that you sort of build between it to minimize the transfer of that. Because otherwise you're heating it, and rather than the heat being contained, it's just kind of being sucked in by the, the Mars itself and trying to pull it away. So
So are you going to need a
those are the
3D
challenges.
printer or something like that? Is there
Oh,
a
absolutely.
technology that's missing that?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah.
Everything's gonna be three. So a lot of the houses, the habitats may be 3D printed ahead of time. So we've seen these construction of houses with concrete where the 3D printer comes out there. And there have been a lot of proposals. You can see YouTube channels that are showing that these,
Yeah.
real serious proposals of how you would build it and the kind of robotic arms. And these are very simple kind of robotic arms that spin around and how they can take the regolith and then transform that. And so you just need to make sure you find enough supplies. So there's going to have to be some water on there. There may be some other important constituents that you need to put in concrete that hopefully you can find locally, or you're going to have to bring that. But for the most part, when you mix concrete here on Earth, a small amount of it is what the Portland cement or whatever is the binding agent, but the majority of it is the aggregate. So if we have to bring that from Earth, okay, I guess we do. But at least the aggregate, which is 90%, we can probably get it locally. So that's should not be a big challenge. We can do a lot of it locally. Some stuff we bring, and eventually the industry will get better and better. But it's all about micro factories. That's what
Mhm.
Mars is going to be doing. Everything's going to be micro factories, which may be to a big benefit on Earth because right now everything is so centralized with our manufacturing and everything. Elon complains about how things have to get moved like all over the place. That every product you have, the
Mhm.
constituent elements that are in there have probably gone around the earth like 7 or 8 times before they finally make it in there.
Yeah.
And a lot of it is because the manufacturing is off somewhere else. But if you can start to make these micro factories and these
Yeah.
materials come in, you don't have to have that big economy. That might be something that you do on Mars because
Yeah.
you have to. And then you
Yeah.
realize,
This
hey,
is
we can use it back home.
Yeah, this is my one of my predictions is that when I was able to speak to Elon and I asked them a question, like asked them, are you guys working on solving global world hunger? And he said we are. He and Elon, he and
Hmm.
Kimball, and he, did his normal reply, which is there is no caloric deficit on Earth, and
Right.
then he stopped. But what his answer would have been if we heard him talk about it, is there's no caloric deficit. What it is about delivering the food that we all can make to the right person at the right place at the right time. And of course, there's corruption and all that that's causing those issues with
Yes.
poverty and everything else. And but in order to do this in Mars, I think they're going to have to do 3D printing and probably 3D printing
Yes.
of both
Absolutely.
food and equipment. And so that's the
Hmm.
only way to do it. Like every home in every location, if you're in Africa or something like that, you should be able to create your own food at that location where you are whenever you need to. And so I'm still thinking that that's the missing technology that they'll
Right.
probably
Right.
come up with one day.
And there are schemes to be able to 3D print different foods, but you still need some sort of feedstock.
Yeah,
And the same thing with this idea of precision fermentation, which is kind of close to that. That you just need to be able to produce these certain things. You just need some certain key ingredients, and those are things that you would probably have to grow locally. And maybe it's not a whole lot. And once you have those, that you get some sort of carbohydrate sources, you get some sort of protein sources, some sort of fat or lipid
yeah,
sources that you're able to create. Boom, you just kind of put them together and you can make almost anything you want at that point. And there's going to be a lot of genetic engineering. So there's going to be a lot of algae and bacteria or yeast. I think primarily it's used that they're going to do a little bit of tinkering with that to be able to produce these certain proteins that you want. So you'll be able to have ice cream on Mars, even though there will not be any cows on Mars. I guarantee there will not be any cows on Mars.
right,
And
right.
it's not clear there'll be any chickens on Mars, but you'll probably still be able to have something that tastes and resembles an
It's like
omelet
that.
or a
Yeah.
hamburger. So those things will be possible because we're already seeing it back home here that we're doing that. And it absolutely makes sense on Mars. And there's one other picture that we can kind of show, which is sort of shows the idea of what the Mars colony might look like someday.
Hmm.
So again, here you see the landing pads to make sure that when they land, they don't create a big dust storm.
Hmm.
Make it far enough away from the city, and it looks a bit like a printed circuit board, which is I think what
Hmm.
Elon has referenced many times. And you can see all the different habitats. You're going to have greenhouses there. You're going to have probably gymnasiums. You're going to have
Hmm.
places where people live, where they like to congregate. It looks like there's probably some solar farms out there. Everything you could imagine you would need in the city that will slowly grow. But at first, it's going to be a very small settlement. It really is going to be an outpost that we'll all be cheering on from Earth and hoping they're doing well and resupplying them. And when they're ready, we're going to come in with more stuff and more stuff. One of the biggest challenges with Mars is what the growth plan is going to be like. Is we're used to this idea of a pipeline, right? Once you get a supply chain kind of going, things come at a reliable rate at the end. And so I know I need a certain amount of stuff, and so it just kind of comes in a certain way. So if I need milk, I just go to the store and I get milk. But if it's one of those things that no, the milk gets delivered once every 2 years at the store, then I have to go to the store and buy 2 years worth of milk.
Hmm.
And so that means your supply lines are are very complicated because you have to deliver so much in one shot that you then have to use up over a 2 year period. And so when the colony starts growing, it's going to happen in these waves. That's why Elon is talking about like 1,000 starships. And while that
Hmm.
sounds rather interesting, it's also a bit crazy because you're going to have these people that have sort of created a settlement that's working fine for a dozen
Hmm.
people. And suddenly you're going to have this huge wave. Is it going to really be 1,000 that are coming in, or is the next one going to be, well,
It's all
let's keep it
robots.
maybe around 10 to,
Yeah.
yeah. So the robots might be important to really scale that up. So if you want to send a thousand ships with humans there, then something really has to be ready. So it's going to have to
Hmm.
be almost like this Fibonacci kind of thing. You start out small, get a little bit bigger, a little bit bigger, a little bit bigger.
Yeah.
You just don't say, all right, we got the settlement. A few things are there. We've been there twice now. Maybe we've gone ahead and we set the scout ships out there with the robots to set up for the first humans that came in. They proved that they can live there. Everything's fine. Now let's send the whole, it's not going to work that way. It's going to be a couple of steps,
Yeah.
which is probably like, Elon is talking about, 2050 is when you would be able to get to that million mark. So I don't see a
That's right.
thousand
Yeah.
starships going there in 2030 or even
Yeah.
2040. That might be kind of crazy. It's going to be
That's why
a little bit longer than that
reusable rockets is so critical.
because there's the other problem we might want to get to, and that is Mars habitable, and will it ever be habitable? And what
Okay.
do we have to do to make sure any sort of colony, the first foothold, will be survivable? We don't want a Jamestown. We want a Plymouth.
Yeah, I
Okay.
gotcha.
So what are the steps that are going to be kind of involved in that? And the first thing is you have to find the right landing zones to have.
Okay.
Now, to point out that there's a lot of hazards. The first hazard is getting there in the first place, and the biggest hazard on getting there in the first place is cosmic radiation. So there's a lot of radiation coming in. There has to be some way to make the spacecraft a little bit impervious to it, and that's very difficult. I mean, there's a couple of ways. One is you lead line it, but you don't want to lead line it because lead is very, very heavy. So you want to do something lighter. The other thing is, it turns out water is pretty good at blocking a lot of those things. So the idea is that you somehow make the outside of the spacecraft, or where you're primarily spending your time in or sleeping, so you're almost like in an aquarium the whole time.
Aquarium.
So that would help block it, to reduce it, because the transit is pretty bad, because in space it's coming from you in all directions.
Oh, okay.
Once you get down on the planet, now you only have to worry about it coming to you just from the sky, because the planet itself will block that from you. So you don't have to worry about that. There's other things probably from the surface you have to worry about, like the perchlorites, and, maybe if there's other radiation hazards down there. But as far as cosmic radiation, it's only going to be coming from the sky. So now on Earth, we don't have to worry about it, because our thick atmosphere does a very good job of blocking that.
Hmm.
The Martian atmosphere is so thin, it does not. Most of it's able to come through. And so you want to look places on Mars that are as low as possible. And, there are, so the first place you want to be at Mars is where it's as warm as possible, which means the equator, right? So that's the first thing. The second thing is that you want to get some places as low as possible. So the blue areas are very, very low. So the lower you get, you actually get a little bit more atmosphere. And it may not seem like very much, but actually is substantial in that it can help cut down the radiation exposure a lot. So the blue areas are good. And I know Jordan Wright, the angry astronaut, he's a big fan of Valverde Marineris, and for all sorts of reasons. One, it's very low. So you would want to be somewhere over in this area here, and it's down along the equator. And he thinks it's absolutely scenic. So the problem with a lot of sites, like when we landed on the moon, and actually a lot of the spacecraft that we've landed on Mars, land in these very prosaic kind of places just because they're very easy to land. You don't have to worry about many boulders or geological features or anything, but they're just boring. So you want to go to some place. So do you really want to land in like places like the middle of the Sahara Desert and say, oh, this is your new home? There's nothing to see. You want to go someplace where you can actually maybe explore and discover certain things. And a valley, I mean, think about the Grand Canyon. The Grand Canyon has exposed Earth's history. It's all there. So geologically, the place you want to be is in the Grand Canyon of Mars, and that's much bigger than the Grand Canyon. And also the cliff sides are the valley goes up extremely high. So there's a couple of advantages there. One is like those cliff sides also provide a little bit of extra protection from incoming radiation, and you're a little bit deeper, and you can see some spots that are very deep. The other thing is that when Zubrin came out with his book, it wasn't clear if there was any water on Mars. I mean, there's speculation that there could have been, that there may have been there, but it may all be gone. But there now seems to be indication there are some water ices, and there might be some subterranean water that we could tap into. And the one thing we all know is that water likes to seek its lowest point. So you start at the lowest point, and then you might be a chance of finding some water very close to that surface right there. And so if we find water, we don't have to schlep the hydrogen there anymore. We will have that already there. We don't have to make the water anymore. It's there. And through electrolysis, we'll be able to create the hydrogen we need for the methane and more O2 that we would need for everything else. So that is, that would be sort of one of the areas. And there's a couple other reasons to want to be there. Now, the habitats we have, people talked about, do we want to go in like lava tubes or caves or something like that? Maybe the boring tunnels would be able to provide something, because that would give adequate protection. We can also use the Martian regolith to help build these homes that are covered. So if we have enough of that, we don't have to worry about coming in. But you still want to have some sort of sunlight. So no one really wants to live in a cave. I mean, I know there was a woman who just spent 500 days in a cave in Spain, but I mean, you do want to come out and see the sunlight and everything else, and just for
Regolith
your
is
psychology.
is
That's
Martian
basically the
soil,
soil,
right?
Martian
And are you
soil,
talking
right?
about like a igloo kind of thing, but made out of
Yes,
soil, a
exactly,
hut?
exactly. So,
Okay,
so the whole idea is you probably have like this inflatable hut, and then you just put a lot of the regolith on top to
yeah,
give you the thickness, because you don't want to bring the concrete from Earth. That's, you just can't do it. So you're
okay,
going to have to use something local. So you'll do that. The other thing is that you just go into hillsides or somewhere else and not worry about that. But the thing is, like, well, you're not seeing any sunlight the whole day. So there are these ideas of habitats that have windows. Now the windows will probably be actually made out of water or ice, literally ice, because
right.
they will block the incoming cosmic radiation much better than glass. But from the horizon, it's not a problem. It's really only from the top. Now, the one thing I want to ask you, Herbert, when's the last time you stared directly into the sun? Now, I know you're in Seattle, so it's probably pretty rare. But when's the last time you looked straight into the sun?
I don't remember, yeah. In
Oh,
Hawaii, maybe, I don't know.
I will
Eclipse?
I will bet
Mhm.
no, I bet you've done it a couple times a year, or maybe almost once a month, even though
Just
you're always told
accidentally?
never look straight in the sun. No,
Mhm.
when the sun's setting.
Oh, yes, of course, I see, gotcha.
Yeah.
That's right. That's
Now
a trick question.
that's the
Yes,
same
that's
thing.
right.
Yeah, so that's the same thing on Mars, is that, from
Yeah,
the horizon, and the reason why you can do that is because you're looking through so much atmosphere compared to
yeah,
when you're looking straight up. So you're
yeah.
looking through hundreds and hundreds of miles of atmosphere versus what might just be, 10 miles of atmosphere going up, or 20 miles, or whatever you want to say it's going up, because it gets very
Mm,
thin. So you
I
have a
see.
lot more of the thick atmosphere, which is why you're not blinded by the sun when it's down low. So it's the same thing
Mm,
that sort of happens on the horizon in Mars. You don't have to worry so much about the cosmic radiation there, but there's like, maybe 130, 120 degrees that you're a little bit worried. So you just make sure you have adequate shielding over there, and you allow the light to be able to come in. So that's what you want to do. Now,
gotcha.
the other thing you can
Okay.
try to do to improve this is that if we can increase the atmosphere of Mars at all, things will get better. So we already see, if you go to the blue spots, they're much better than being over by the yellow or the red spots.
Yeah,
And that's
okay.
just an altitude difference there.
Mhm.
So what can we do to improve it? Well, it turns out, if you want to do the terraforming, there's a couple things that you need. One, you need the resources. So hopefully they're there. If not, you're going to have to bring them from somewhere else. You need energy, and you probably need time. So a lot of times when I think about the resources, like, well, if we want to bring the water escapes, we're going to have to bring the water back from somewhere, unless the water happens to be hiding underneath. But we think a lot of it probably boiled off and went in there, along with a lot of the atmosphere. But some of it seems to have condensed, and that's why at the poles there is basically solid carbon dioxide, or what you would call dry ice, up there. And we see seasonally it kind of goes up and down depending on the temperature. So it seems like there's a good supply of carbon dioxide at the poles, just like
Mhm.
there's a good supply of water ice on Earth. And we know that if you melt that our oceans are going to rise because of the excess. And the same thing on Mars. Like, let's basically do the same thing there, except we want the atmosphere to fill up. And if we do that, we start to get more pressure, and that changes a lot of things. And especially would help that. So, there has been the idea of, nuke Mars, which I'm not sure that everyone has said the energy you need for that is not going to be quite enough. But if you do something to supplement, then you would increase the Martian pressure quite a bit. And then by doing that, you'll actually get more warmth. And then you get this vicious cycle that it makes it more likely to sublimate, and other kind of volatile gases may be able to come out, and you can start to increase the atmospheric pressure somehow. It's not clear there's enough to give us, the kind of atmospheric pressure we're used to here on Earth, because first, they don't quite have the gravity, and we would need a bulky amount of it. But eventually, maybe we're bringing that in from the asteroids or from somewhere else, where we might be able to find a lot of those volatiles, because we believe that's where the water in the atmosphere of the Earth came from, was cometary bombardment. So
Yeah.
we have artificial lakes on Earth. Well, we can have an artificial atmosphere by just speeding up the process of nature. Uh, but before we do that, there is one very important question that we have to answer or solve, and that is, why did Mars lose its atmosphere in the first place?
Mm, mhm.
Any idea why? Now, first, when I was a kid, that would have been a very controversial statement, because we thought Mars didn't have an atmosphere ever. But now there seems to be
Mhm.
a lot of evidence that it probably had an atmosphere, a very thick atmosphere, and it probably had oceans like Earth. So there is pretty much a lot of consensus that it's there. And then why did it go away? Well, it went away for a
Mm,
couple reasons. One is Mars is smaller than the Earth, which means its gravitational attraction is a little bit smaller, so it's a lot easier for the gases to escape. And the other is because it's smaller, Mars cooled off earlier. And what's one thing that Earth has that Mars doesn't have that is not necessarily an atmosphere, and that, as you might know, is a magnetosphere. The
Mhm.
reason we have a magnetosphere is because the Earth's core is molten, and we believe that it comes from the fact that you have these currents being generated from the actual flow and movement of a lot of the magma and the core that creates this dynamo effect that creates a magnetic field that surrounds the Earth. And that's very important because the solar wind, which is all these particles coming off the sun, if they impinge with the upper part of the atmosphere, are able to hit the molecules there enough and give them enough energy that they now actually have escape velocity and they get peeled off. So you get this atmospheric erosion from that happening, and the magnetosphere protects Earth from that. And they believe what happened is about 1 billion years ago, Mars cooled down so much that its core is now solid. It lost its magnetic
Yeah.
field. Now the solar wind came in and stripped it away. So before you can do anything about terraforming and the idea of bringing the atmosphere back, you got to solve that problem. And if you solve that problem, you get rid of some of the radiation problem, because it's not just cosmic radiation that you have to deal with on Mars. It's also like the solar wind, what's coming in from there. So we do want to get protected from that. So there are some ideas for that. And the first thing I want to talk about Lagrange points. Are you familiar with the idea of Lagrange points?
No.
Okay, so let me bring this. Now, there are two videos I think everyone should see. This first one, and are we displaying it right now? Yeah, okay. So this is from Isaac Arthur, who has a great channel that speculates on all sorts of things. And this is about, talking about different ways of being able to make a magnetosphere on Mars. And part of it is the description of the Lagrange points. And these are points of stability between different planetary bodies. And so this is an example of Mars, the Earth and the Moon. And there's a point right between Earth and the Moon where the gravitational fields have both become equal. So in other words, you're being pulled equally in both directions, to either fall towards Earth or to fall towards Mars, or
Mhm.
towards the Moon.
Mhm.
And that's called Lagrange point one. And it turns out it's a point of stability. So what do you think about it is, like, if you have a hill where you go up a hill with your bicycle, when you get to the top of the hill, there's all these different directions you can go down there. But it seems very unstable because the slightest nudge and you're going to kind of go over. So imagine you kind of go up there, and maybe it's going to be a marble you're going to put up there, but you get like just a little dimple up at the top that you can kind of rest in. That you're kind of stable there. But if you get just enough of a nudge, you kind of fall out of it and you're going to go off in a different direction. And it turns out these become like virtual masses almost. You can actually orbit around it. As a matter of fact, L2 is where the James Webb telescope right now is orbiting right around there. So it's actually to go around here. And then I think the lunar gateway, the idea is to do some kind of weird thing around L1. But there's all these different points of stability. And if you looked at this as being the sun instead, and this is being Mars, Mars also has a couple. And these here is where Starlink would put their satellites, because
Mhm.
these are stable orbits that actually lead either in front or behind it. So it's a very stable point. You don't have to have it in an orbit underneath where they're always spinning around. You put it there and it almost becomes like a geosat. It's always in the
Mhm.
same place in the sky as far as you're concerned. So that is what Starlink is going to do. Now, the other reason for these is that this has something to do with the magnetosphere. And another one of my favorite YouTubers out there is Anton Petrov. And he covers all sorts of great topics in physics and space and astronomy. And when I saw this a few years ago, this was talking about a proposal from NASA to create a magnetic field around Mars. And it uses the L1 point. So this is the L1 point over here, and this is Mars. So actually you're thinking, well, let's just create a big magnetic field out here with a satellite with a big solar array and just make a huge magnetic field that will then protect
Wow.
Mars.
Gotcha.
And because the L1 is always the same relationship between Mars and the sun, as it orbits
Mhm.
around, it's not orbiting
Would
faster or
be.
slower than Mars, but it's locked in there. So it's always in
Yeah,
the
so
same
cool.
position. So it's a really cool idea. And of course, when I first
Mhm.
heard about that and read the headline, I had like the imagination, oh, they're going to boot up the magnetic field of Mars. How awesome. And then I saw this and I was like, oh, disappointed. And then I went home and I said, oh, why did they do this? And now this is my crazy idea that no one's really going to do. I was like, well, wait a minute. why don't they just get like one of those, a really big 16 penny nail like I had as a kid, and just like drive it from the North Pole to the South Pole, put some telephone wire around thing, plug it to a really big D cell, and then just
Sure.
create a field
Create a
that way.
battery.
And
Sure.
so I'm just imagining, it's like, could you do that? I said, well, wait a minute. You know what you could do is that you already have, once you get through the crust, there is already like iron down there. So you already have like a conducting loop. And I'm sort of wondering, it's like, wow, what if you were able to tunnel around in some sort of helical pattern around there? And then I'm thinking, well, how would you boot this thing up and get the energy? And I'm almost wondering, and this is crazy. This is where some physicists are going to come in and say, well, you're not right. Or maybe one of them will say, hey, he's onto something. Is the aurora borealis is a result of the solar wind being redirected to the poles. So you have all these charged particles that are streaming down at the poles and just crashing into the atmosphere and energizing with all this light. That's a current. And I'm almost thinking, well, wait a minute. What I should do is like, that's my battery. Stick a big antenna up
Nice.
there, capture this thing that we're kind of pulling in. And so if you're able to bootstrap it and kind of get the field going, it might be you could almost energize the field by capturing the solar wind. Now, it's a crazy idea. I've talked to some guys who are physicists, no, you maybe really can't do it, but it'll make a great science fiction story someday for anyone out there trying to think about how
Sure.
you go ahead and boot it. So as crazy as that sounds, it turns out, this was about 5 years ago, this video. The one from Isaac Arthur was about a year ago, and it was based on this paper. Okay, how to create an artificial magnetic sphere for Mars. And one of the ideas was that you actually could restart the iron core, but they're not thinking about boring on down there. They're thinking of like literally taking wires and wrapping it around the equator, which is the
There
same
you go.
way, same
Yeah.
idea. And then
Yeah.
booting it. And the question is, where do you get the energy? But, there's really serious thoughts like, we could do that. So I wasn't that crazy. And that if there's some way to do it. Now, here's my crazier one. This one you're really going to love. Are you a fan of MacGyver?
Of course.
Okay. All right. Now, do you know how magnets are made?
No.
Especially the
Are
rare earth
magnets made?
magnets that you see?
No.
Like, because we know the rare earth magnets are needed in the Tesla motors and everything else. And I
Uh-huh.
just assumed like, oh, you just like put the stuff in here, and melt it down and get into shape and poof, it's a magnet, right? It's like, no, when you put it in there, it's not magnetized at all. So you have to magnetize it. And it turns out you have to take the solid material that you have there, put it into a magnetic field, and then hit it really hard with a hammer.
Oh, really?
And then like you give it that, and then the crystals will start to align with it. So you bang it
Hmm.
a couple times. It's like, wow, that's really weird. Because I always assumed like when it's solidified, because a lot of the lodestones that the Greeks found and everything like that was igneous rock that when it would when it froze, solidified, it then picked up whatever the local magnetic field was, which is why they had this property of magnetism. But there was like an episode of MacGyver where he actually, he needed to come up with a magnet because he dropped his keys down in the sewer grate or something like that.
Okay.
And he was like half wounded and it was like really hard. And he ended up finding like a crowbar, a metal crowbar. And it's explaining, all you have to do is like take it and bang it a bunch of times and it will magnetize and go down there and do it. It's like, wow. So that's how you make a magnet. So I'm thinking, all right, let's see if we can turn this core into a big magnet. Okay, so it'll be a static magnet. It doesn't have to be a dynamic magnet. And the one thing we need to do is we need to hit it really hard,
Sure.
and we need to have a really strong magnetic field at the same time. So,
Uh-huh.
but some of the other things that Earth is or that Mars is missing is like maybe some volatiles and a little bit of extra mass here and there. So, like, let's redirect it, an asteroid towards Mars. That's big enough
Right. That
that
could
when it
happen. I
hits,
mean,
it's
that's
just going to
yeah.
ring that thing like a bell. All right.
Yeah.
And when that happens, you make sure you have a fusion bomb somewhere, because the whole thing about a nuclear bomb is you get the EMP, the
Yeah.
electromagnetic pulse. And so you get like this big magnetic field. It's like, well, just time that thing and just boom, boom. And then, you got it. All right. So that's my crazy idea for being able to restart the magnetic field of Mars. Again, pure science fiction, never going to
Sure.
happen, but I'm
Yeah.
going to put it out there.
Uh,
So,
Elon did
uh,
talk about nuking Mars North poles
right,
and the poles,
right,
and then
right.
that's maybe
Now
something similar.
the thing I want to point out is like on this whole idea of terraforming Mars, is if the whole idea is like we're going to start this project terraform Mars to make it verdant Mars, like in that image, that is generations and generations away. I mean,
Yeah.
the most optimistic is that it's a couple hundred years. I mean, realistically, it's more like millennia. And probably the only science fiction series that maybe captured that properly was The Expanse. where, in the expanse, they started to terraform Mars and they realized this is really hard and gave up on it, after
Oh,
like
yeah.
200 years, to realize that we just hadn't made any progress because, again, you need lots of energy, you need lots of resources, and you're just going to need lots of time. Now, it doesn't mean we don't get started, but we make sure that whatever we do is going to provide benefit to the generation now. It'll, of course, it's going to help future generations, but we have to kind of do something because, of course, we're the beneficiaries of like a lot of the roads that were started to be built over 100 years ago, and all we did was start to pave them and everything else, and the railroads had already been there. So we've been building on what our ancestors had built for us, and it'll be the same thing. But part of it is, what do you try to do to thicken the atmosphere at least a little bit? Getting that magnetic field started will probably be the top one. So you would do that. And so you want to look at, there's the long term, which is quite a bit. There's kind of the midterm, and then we have to get right down to the short term. The short term is like finding the right spot, making sure you have enough that you can get that outpost. You can prove that the outpost can survive. And then once you do that, and so long as that outpost is there, you're committed. I mean, not only are they committed, Earth is
Yeah.
committed. They have to
Can
send
we-
supplies routinely.
Let's talk about the society. So it just makes so much sense now that he's got the Twitter and turning into the everything app and having the X coin and being a financial transaction, being,
Mhm.
entertainment, being, so got commerce, it's got voting in it.
Mhm.
It will be kind of the new way. And he's talked about what kind of a government was he talking about? Come this way that the
Basically,
citizen
a direct democracy
voting,
that
direct
you vote
democracy.
on everything.
Right.
And I thought that would sort of make sense. You already do that kind of as a shareholder. So
Yeah.
every shareholder gets to vote on every resolution, but you have a board of
Mhm.
directors, which would probably be a governing body that maybe makes recommendations on what they think would be the wisest thing, or maybe they try to craft or come up with legislation. So you might still have some kind of legislative body, but in the end, when it comes to a vote, those legislators may represent certain districts, and they may have the proxies of those, so that you just sign this proxy statement to say that legislator can vote however he wants. I'm with him. Or you might be like, don't trust the guy. I didn't really vote for him. He wasn't my guy. This is what my vote's going to be. And that means every single piece of legislation that goes up there, everyone gets a vote on it.
Yeah.
It's not just a small crew of people where, corruption and all sorts of influence peddling, where they sort of trade votes back and forth because, I'm really against this legislation, but there's this other one I want. So you do the horse trading. And that's what causes these systems to break. So it really is going to come down to that everyone is able to vote. They'll be able to vote anonymously, so no one really knows what anyone else's vote, so you can vote your conscience. And so that will be a true direct democracy, which the American experiment wanted to do something like that. It just wasn't practical
Mhm.
because we didn't have the ability to communicate like that. It took such a long time
No,
to
you
get
can't.
to the Continental Congress and everything else, the horseback
Yeah.
and with
Yeah.
mail. But now the technology has changed, so governing bodies really have to think about that, and that we make sure we get real time information. I mean, look today. I mean, the Fed raised interest rates again, and Elon's been saying it's old data. You're making this decision on data that is very, very old. So again, the idea is that you will have all the information that you need right there at your
Real time.
fingertips to make the decision
Mhm.
that makes sense real time today on what is the best thing. And I
So,
agree that
getting to
connected.
yeah, getting to Mars, obviously, it's an impossible dream. But actually, when you stop and think about what Elon and Tesla and all the other companies have achieved at this point, right? Reusable market rocket is number one because you have to get, like you said, to 1,000 trips. And then the robots is number two. If you got robots, it actually solves a lot of things. As you were sharing your information, it made me, you basically said it, that you don't need a lot of things on the first, second, or even third visit. You don't need to worry about food. You can take years to develop the food because if you've
Mhm.
got robots, you don't need the sustainable atmosphere, the protection. Those kinds that can be built by the robots, and it could take years before you get there. um, then so that's one. And so the other thing I think that's missing is, like I said, some sort of 3D printer, home builder, anything else you think that's absolutely critical that hasn't been built yet, which therefore is your prediction of what the next company that Elon might be announcing, some sort of
Oh boy,
food.
boy.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I know they'd be doing a lot in the food. So there would be Tesla is really good at manufacturing, and SpaceX. So Elon recognizes that the key to everything is manufacturing and how you
Yeah.
revolutionize that. And there's a lot of these different components that are coming in there, and some of it, of course, is 3D printing. But the main thing with 3D printing is you need feedstocks. So you've got to figure out, well, how do I get the material that I need for this? And it's going to be a bit tricky because we use a lot of plastics down here on Earth. Where
Right.
do plastics come from? They come from fossil fuels. Oh, you don't have a whole lot of that. So what's the feedstock going to be for that? But not all 3D printing has to be plastic. It could be a lot of these other materials. So they're going to have to figure out how to maybe
Mhm.
make those materials. And there are bio ways of being able to create bioplastics that could be used. So you would see something there. But I think a lot of it is going to be in the refining. How do you come up with a more efficient way of refining things without having these just huge factories? We have to keep them small. So everything has to be a micro factory, and thinking of keeping small footprints and making everything so it's not energy intensive to be able to do it. And then the other thing is just going to be learning how to recycle and reuse everything. So it's going to be a very, very closed loop ecosystem. So as I was mentioning, there's no such thing as waste heat on Mars. So you're not going to have an industrial process which is just like, oh, we've got to get rid of this heat. There's not going to be an effluent or something like that that you get rid of because, oh, we don't need it. It's like, no, it's going to be useful over here somewhere else. So everything is going to be tied together and in order for that to work successfully. And we can learn all of that stuff here on Earth because we need to. Everyone was complaining. It's like, we don't have enough water on Earth. It's like, we got plenty of water.
Mhm.
We just, all we have to do is take the water that we have and turn it into fresh water more efficiently. So it's there. It's just kind of finding a way to take the resources. We have a lot of these other resources. The problem is we tend to chuck them out rather than saying, oh, we can take them and recycle them and use them. So again, like lithium, everyone says, oh, we don't have enough lithium for all the batteries.
Yeah.
Like, well, we do, and eventually we won't have to mine lithium anymore. We're going to figure out how to recycle it. And Mars is about a recycling economy. You will not throw any scrap out.
Yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely everything's going to be
Yeah.
used. So, I mean, to me, that's the most important, maybe, new thing is that is Elon's company would be something that is really into a
Recycling.
reusable
Yeah.
economy of some sort.
Yeah. Well, now that they brought back JB Straubel and Redwood
Hmm. Yeah,
Materials, I think that
makes sense.
recycling is the next division that they're going to be either buying, acquiring Redwood Materials, or growing. And so, yeah, these are good thoughts, Scott. Very
Yeah,
nice.
yeah, yeah.
Appreciate it.
And
All right.
mhm.
Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you, Scott. So, please follow
Thank you,
Scott
Herbert.
on Twitter under the handle at Going Ballistic 5. Hopefully, you learned something new, and we're going to bring him back on again. But that was great. You covered a lot of the technologies that Elon is and the Musk industries that are working on. And after talking to you, it feels like it's actually doable. Your dream's going
It's
to come true.
it's still it's hard. I know we're going to, I really believe that in my lifetime I will see
It's going to happen. Yeah,
humans on Mars.
humans.
I really believe it's going to be there, but it's going to be tough sledding to be able to get up to that. But I think once we're there, we're up to the challenge. Human beings can do
Yeah.
amazing things when they decide that they want to, and all you need, like Elon says, that a reason to get up in the morning. And this is a reason for a lot of people to get up in the morning. It's exciting.
It is exciting. Okay. Thanks, everybody. See you next time.